Welcome to the latest episode of What Your GP Doesn't Tell You, the podcast for both doctors and patients with me, Liz Tucker. This is the last podcast of 2024, and I just wanted to take a moment to thank all my listeners and supporters. The resources and lovely comments you send me really make this all worthwhile, and I simply couldn't run the podcast without you. So thank you so much, and wishing you all the very best for 2025. In this week's episode, I'm talking to investigative journalist Katherine Eban, who has uncovered one of the largest medical scandals imaginable, affecting millions of patients. I read an awful lot of medical books, and they often contain shocking facts and revelations. But Katherine's book, Bottle of Lies, Ranbaxy and the Dark Side of Indian Pharma, published by Juggernaut, is truly jaw-dropping. It examines the shocking reality of just what happens, or perhaps more accurately, what doesn't happen, when generic drugs that we import are manufactured in countries with poor regulation. When a drug is first approved, it's released with its own brand name. But once the drug's patent expires, then other manufacturers are allowed to make cheaper, generic versions of the same medication. Now, most patients, and indeed many doctors, think these generic drugs are the same as the brand name ones, but they're not. As we explore in this podcast, current regulations allow them to be markedly different. That means they may work in a very different way to the brand name drug, which has huge implications for patients. But although that's worrying enough, many of the world's generic drugs are made in India and China, where, as Katherine explains, they can be made very cheaply, and there's little regulation. These drugs can be adulterated, contain contaminants, and may even be completely ineffective. In what was India's largest pharmaceutical company, Ranbaxy, 200 of its generic drugs were revealed to have been filed with the American drug regulator, the FDA, with inadequate, falsified, or completely missing information. And an FDA investigator found in over 80 plants in India and China he visited, 80% had falsified data. These generic drugs are sold across the world, so may well end up on the shelves of your local pharmacy. So what can we do as patients and doctors to protect ourselves? But before we get to the interview with Katherine, a brief request from me. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to leave a review on Spotify or Apple, that would be much appreciated. It really helps. You can also become a paid supporter of the podcast at patreon.com/whatyourgpdoesn'ttellyu or via PayPal on my website, whatyourgpdoesn'ttellyu.com. A huge amount of work goes into both the research and production of this podcast, so even a small amount of money makes a huge difference. And you can find out more information about the pod on my website, where you can sign up for the podcast mailing list, follow me on Twitter at Liz C. Tucker, and on my Substack account, liz.tucker.substack.com. Many thanks. And now back to the interview with Katherine. Katherine Eban is an award-winning investigative journalist, best-selling author, Vanity Fair special correspondent, and Andrew Carnegie Fellow. Her articles on pharmaceutical counterfeiting, gun trafficking, coercive interrogations by the CIA, and COVID-19's origins have won numerous awards. Here's Katherine's interview. Well, Katherine, thank you so much for joining the podcast today.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me.
So, Katherine, your interest in the subject of generic drugs really began after a phone call from a journalist who hosts a US radio program.
That's right. It was 2008, and I got a call from a fellow named Joe Grayton, who hosts a radio program called The People's Pharmacy. He said that listeners had been calling in and complaining about their generic drugs and saying that they were switched from a brand to generic and they were having symptoms and side effects. And he took those complaints to the FDA, and officials there basically said to him it was psychosomatic, that if the shape or the size of the pill changed, they thought there was something wrong. So he's a pharmacologist by training. He did not believe that. And he knew of my work. I'd been on his program before, and he called me, and I remember the words he said, "What is wrong with the drugs?"
And I have to say, after reading your book, and I read many books about medical stories and issues, it's truly one of the most shocking I've read and probably has greater implications for our health, probably almost than anything. Yet it's an issue that largely seems to be swept under the carpet.
Swept under the carpet is one way to put it. Another way is that people really did not understand what was going on. I'm not sure that it was people understood and were turning a blind eye. I think they truly did not understand what the problem was. And that was partly because regulators were insisting that if these drugs were approved, they were identical. And that really proved not to be the case.
Because actually, I think an awful lot of doctors as well as patients assume a generic drug is exactly the same formulation as the branded drug. But actually, they only need to be bioequivalent, which is not the same thing at all.
Right. First, let me say that every country has different regulatory standards. The FDA's standards have long been interpreted as the world's gold standards, and many countries follow FDA standards. But, when I started my investigation into this, I learned a couple of things immediately about the FDA's standards that really surprised me. So, first of all, as you said, the drugs are not identical and they're not required to be. They are supposed to fall within a range of bioequivalence, which means roughly the same absorption into the bloodstream as the brand name drug, but with sort of an outlying range on the upside and the downside. That means if you get switched from one brand of generic to a different brand of generic, you might be having a big margin in between of bioequivalence.
You say that the bioequivalence can be 25% above or 20% below the absorption rate of the brand name drug.
Yeah, that is correct. So that was surprising. But there were a couple of other things that surprised me even more. So when I asked an FDA officials, how did they test for bioequivalence? They didn't. They don't test. They rely on the company's data. So the companies are supposed to conduct tests and submit the data from those tests to the FDA. That's what the FDA reviews. Then when I asked the FDA, well, what if a company is not truthful and ethical? They said to me, the approval system requires the ethical behavior of the applicant. Otherwise, the whole house of cards will fall down.
So people think around the world of the FDA as the gold standard in drug regulation. I think that's probably true. And a lot of the other drug regulators take their lead from the FDA. But having said that, I have to say, and we'll get into this more as we go through our conversation, not only does the FDA seem to be very credulous when it comes to taking information on trust, even when they know there's a problem. We'll talk about this more when we get into the Ranbaxy case. But when it was extremely clear that fraud had been committed, and you would have thought, that's it, the FDA will clearly take action, stop all production until they've fully investigated. I don't want to sort of preempt our conversation, but it was a process that went on for a number of years.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it went on for 8 years.
So just going back to the difference one can have in the absorption rate of these generic drugs, if I'm taking a regular drug and I'm prescribed different generics, then each time, effectively, I may be getting almost a different drug.
The other issue is you may not be getting a drug at all, because by definition, a drug has to be tested a certain way. And what my investigation uncovered is that there was an actual failure in many cases to test the drugs at all or to minimally test the drugs. Some of these overseas manufacturers were basically limiting their testing to what they could get away with.
So what were you talking about with the different absorption rates? That's the best case scenario.
That's the best case scenario.
But actually, what you discovered was many of those drugs may be adulterated, they may be weaker, they may have impurities, or they may have no active ingredients in them at all.
For certain countries, it's a very widespread practice called dual track production. In many instances, these companies are completely making up data. They didn't test, they invented data in order to get regulatory approval. So the regulatory standard amounts to what they can get away with. Now, the drugs may have active ingredients, but if they're not tested, they cannot really be deemed to be a drug, because how do you know if they're going to heal or hurt? And the only way to determine whether a drug is effective is through testing.
Now, the reason that we have generic drugs is because of the very high cost of brand name drugs. Of course, you in the US pay the highest prices of all countries. And in fact, the largest generic drug manufacturers are outside the US.
Yeah, I mean, in the US, over 80% of our drugs are generic. And the majority of those drugs are coming from overseas. They're coming from India and China.
And obviously, one of the issues with that, if the majority of the generic drug companies are not based in the US, that makes it much harder for the FDA to regularly visit and scrutinize.
Absolutely. And here, after years of investigation, I uncovered a striking difference. So in the US, when the FDA inspects a company, they show up unannounced, they stay as long as is needed, and they run an inspection of a plant. Overseas, it was completely different. They were contacting these plants months in advance. They were requesting permission to visit. They were, by agreement, determining a day of visitation, and then the plant would invite the inspectors to come and actually issue a letter of invitation for purposes of obtaining a visa. The manufacturing plants would arrange all the local plans, the hotel, the transportation. What resulted from this were staged inspections that they could plan in advance for, where they could fake data, they could destroy data, they could create a sort of stage set of compliance. They would send luxury vehicles to pick up the inspectors. They would take them on tourist outings. In some cases, they offered straight up bribes. The sort of charitable name was regulatory tourism, and the old-fashioned name is just corruption.
Because ironically, FDA officials aren't allowed to take more than a $20 gift, but effectively putting them up in very nice hotels, much nicer than they would normally be able to stay in, and all the other things that went around it, was effectively a financial bribe of sorts.
Right. They were also able, by arranging the hotel, in some cases, they were able to bug the hotel rooms. So they could listen in at night to what the inspectors were talking about as far as who they were going to try to interview and what they were going to try to see. So it turned into a very corrupt cat and mouse game that did not meet the bottom line requirement of getting a candid look at these manufacturing plants.
And what was interesting was the systematic level of this. This isn't one bad egg. This is a planned process where everybody from the top level to the bottom is involved.
Absolutely. I mean, that's really a good point. It was completely systematic. I was shocked by that. It was not just one bad company. It was not just big companies or small companies. It was an industry-wide practice.
Now, one company that illustrates really well what we're talking about is the story of Ranbaxy, which was India's biggest drug company. And what you describe sounds more like a script from The President's Men than the pharmaceutical industry. And it all starts when a scientist called Dinesh Thakur, he's been working in the US for Bristol Myers Squibb, and he's hired by Ranbaxy in 2003, and he begins to realize that all is not quite as it should be.
Yeah. He was excited to go back over to India and really help his country to develop cutting edge practices. He was recruited to Ranbaxy. At the point that he went over to India, it was the fastest growing generic company with a goal of an annual $1 billion in sales. And he began little by little to realize that there was a dramatic difference between the claims that the company was making to regulators and the tests that they had actually done. And his supervisor, Raj Kumar, who was a very ethical man, directed him to basically review the company's entire global portfolio and analyze what the divergence was between the claims made to regulators and the testing that had actually been done. Dinesh took his team and they did this analysis and they created a PowerPoint of their findings. And that PowerPoint very clearly indicated that Ranbaxy had committed a global crime because it said that over 200 products in more than 40 countries had been filed with inadequate or falsified or completely missing data.
Therefore, there was no guarantee that these drugs did what people thought they should do.
Absolutely. Or more importantly, what the company claimed they did. These were drugs that were not fit for human consumption.
So if it's 200 drugs, do you have any sort of sense of how many patients might have been affected by this?
That's a good question. And I tried to come to a sort of systematic number, which was very challenging, but clearly millions of patients were affected by these substandard drugs.
And in fact, you mentioned that Thakur's 3-year-old has an ear infection, which didn't get better when the child was initially given generic drugs. And when he is doing this work, that's something that he comes back to remember.
Well, that's right. I mean, it happened right at the time that he was discovering all of this, which is that the Ranbaxy antibiotic was not effective. And so they switched to a brand name antibiotic and he got well immediately.
So they've now got this shocking data, which could not be worse. So his boss takes it to the Ranbaxy board meeting. And I have to say, I think possibly both of them were slightly naive, because it should have been clear at this point that pretty much everybody in the company was involved. But what happens at the board meeting?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, good point that really what they uncovered was Ranbaxy's open secret. I mean, you had a situation where literally almost everybody in the company understood that their job was to produce pristine data that would get approvals, not to make sure that the testing accurately reflected the data. So sort of fraud was the business model of this company.
The company's success is how many drug applications it can get through the FDA. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, through the FDA and regulators around the world, including European regulators.
So this is the EMA, the MHRA.
Absolutely.
All across the world.
Yes, they were deceiving regulators around the world. So Raj Kumar took this PowerPoint presentation to a subcommittee of the board of directors and basically said, what we need to do is we need to come clean. We need to pull every affected drug product off the shelves and tell regulators that these have to be retested and retest them faithfully and accurately, and then reapply to submit them. Only one member of the board expressed even the faintest surprise at all of this. And another one basically said, how can we destroy these findings? They wanted to deep six this record that Dinesh Thakur had created.
So they're not even trying to hide it. If it was a Western company, the company would have been rather more cunning. They'd say, well, thank you so much for bringing all of this information to us. This is so valuable. We will be looking into this in such great detail. Leave it with us, and then bury it. But they don't even feel the need to do that.
Right. That's correct. They made their intention to bury it clear on the spot. They directed the PowerPoint to be destroyed and the computer on which it was created to be destroyed. And Raj Kumar, realizing that this was the path the company was going to take, resigned. That left Dinesh Thakur alone and extremely vulnerable inside the company. And they ginned up an audit of his division and came in and planted porn on his work computer and forced him out of the company. And, at that point, he just thought he was done. he was finished. He had relocated his family to India. He had left the U.S. and a good life and a solid job in the U.S. And at that point, his wife did not want to leave India because her family was there. So he was stuck as to what he was going to do next.
And we should say that in India, it's not just a question of being cold-shouldered by your colleagues if you become a whistleblower. There can be genuine physical danger.
Absolutely. Whistleblowers are killed all the time in India. There are no legal protections for them. It's very much unlike the United States. A Ranbaxy could not happen in the United States the way it went down. That's not because, we have more ethical people than in India. That's not what I'm saying. The reason it couldn't happen is because you'd have half the company running to regulators and blowing the whistle. So the idea that you would have hundreds of people inside of a company know what's going on and nobody says a word is partly because of the lack of protections for whistleblowers and the sort of very strict hierarchical system of how companies are run.
And so finally, Thakur contacts the FDA by email anonymously.
So he was trying to figure out what to do. And he just could not get the injustice of what had happened out of his mind. And the thing that bothered him most was the AIDS drugs being made for African countries, because he knew that they were dramatically substandard, had not been adequately tested. And in fact, those were some of the worst drugs that Ranbaxy was making, right? Because they knew that there were not going to be regulators who were going to be able to check.
Because we should say, on top of all of the horror that's gone on, the European and US drugs made by Ranbaxy were at a slightly higher standard. The drugs being sold to the poorer countries were even worse.
That's absolutely right. Their manufacturing standard was whatever they could get away with. And that's one of the reasons that the drugs made for India were so poor, because the Indian regulators never checked. And that's why Dinesh's son got a completely worthless antibiotic made for the Indian market. But so he was thinking about what to do, and he created a fictitious email account, and he essentially sort of took on the voice of a poorly educated bench scientist within the company and began writing to regulators around the world. He wrote to Anvisa in Brazil, CAFEPRIS in Mexico, the WHO, the FDA, European regulators, and basically tried to direct them to what was happening inside of the company. And really, everybody ignored him. The messages he sent were not really authoritative enough to break through the bureaucracies he was writing to. And finally, in August of 2005, he wrote this very direct and authoritative email to the FDA commissioner.
And how long is this after he's resigned from Ranbaxy?
He's been gone now for months, but he couldn't get it out of his head. He writes to the FDA, and finally he gets contacted back. That is what triggers the investigation into Ranbaxy.
But what seems so extraordinary, which is what I began to talk about at the start of our conversation, he provides pretty compelling data, and he's increasingly frustrated. He can't believe that now he's got a line into the FDA. They're taking so long to take action.
Yeah, they launched this investigation, and from relatively early on, they have a copy of this PowerPoint that was shown to the board of directors, which spells out 200 drug products in over 40 countries, false data.
Isn't that the point, that they just step in and say, we're not taking any more drugs from this company until this is sorted out?
Yeah, that PowerPoint is literally a confession to a global crime. What's extraordinary is, while this division of the FDA called the Office of Criminal Investigation is conducting their investigation, the regulatory arm of the FDA, which is a different division, is getting applications for more products from Ranbaxy and giving them approval
I mean, you say, I think, that there were 27 applications approved after he reported the fraud. I mean, that's terrifying.
Yes. What's even worse is that they gave them the most valuable drug approval for generics that could have possibly existed, which was a first to file application for generic Lipitor in the United States. So that was the highest volume drug. By submitting their application first and getting approved in, I believe it was in 2008, they get exclusive rights to sell the first generic Lipitor on the market for 6 months before facing any generic competition. Within the first 24 hours of sales, they made $100 million. This is 3 years after the FDA gets incontrovertible proof that this company is committing fraud.
But how does this happen? I mean, I know lots of organizations operate in silos, but surely the group looking at this condemning data have to be saying to those who are approving the drugs, what the hell are you doing?
I mean, the people who worked on this case, their minds are simply blown that this is happening. But it's this sort of freaky bureaucratic apparatus. The FDA is perennially in a defensive crouch because they're afraid of being sued by companies. And the whole system of approvals that the FDA has erected is all in jeopardy. So everything's at risk for the FDA. That's sort of institutionally how they see it. They have a reporting obligation to Congress.
But it's interesting that they don't tell Congress the full story. You know, if Congress understands, there's no point approving a drug if it's not the drug that you think it is. And Congress don't have that information.
And in fact, there were congressional investigators who got wind of the investigation into Ranbaxy, asked FDA officials directly, does this investigation have anything to do with drug quality? And the FDA said no.
Why?
I don't know the answer to that. Over the 10 years that I investigated this, I got to the bottom of a lot of things, but I don't know the answer to that question.
I mean, the FDA, and it's not the only regulator that gets criticised for this, is often criticised as being too close to the drug industry. And it is unquestionably underfunded. But in a case as egregious as this, it still seems extraordinarily puzzling.
I agree with you. There was real institutional failure here. There's no other way to look at it. I mean, this was a dark chapter for the FDA.
And Ranbaxy does actually have a US headquarters. In fact, it's a US exec at the US base becomes suspicious that a diabetes drug, metformin, has actually data that's too perfect. Because if you've got the brand name drug and the generic drug, you would expect some variation.
That's right. This was a scientist named Kathy Spreen. She had started thinking, God, this company that I'm working for is terrific. Their drugs are so good that the data from the drugs looks almost identical to the brand. And then she was like, wait a second, why does it look identical to the brand? I mean, she described to me holding up the two sets of data like under a light, and the curve is exactly the same. So she began requesting the underlying data from India, and she kept on getting excuses. Oh, we'll get it to you. We're so busy. We can't find it. And finally, she told them, I don't care if the data is written on toilet paper. Just send me something. And she never got it.
She was quite suspicious at that point.
Correct.
And while this FDA investigation is going on, remarkably, Ranbaxy is in negotiation with a Japanese drug company that's interested in buying them. And they don't seem to uncover anything of what's going on.
Right. So at this point, you have several different things happening at once. You have an active Justice Department investigation. So you have the FBI and the Justice Department in the US closing in. You've got a grandson of the company's founder, Malvinder Singh, and his brother, Shavinder, who are looking at their company potentially all of their wealth in the company in jeopardy because of this investigation, they want to offload the company before it becomes worthless. And you've got this old line Japanese company, Daiichi Sankyo, that is looking at the landscape of pharmaceuticals and realizing that most of their product line is very expensive branded drugs. And they want a global footprint. They want generics. And Malvinder and Shavinder Singh begin to court officials from Daiichi Sankyo. So there comes a certain point at which the lawyers for Daiichi Sankyo, we want to see all the liabilities. We want to see all of this. And Malvinder and Shavinder lie. They just lie about the state of the company, about the integrity of the data.
And even create false minutes from that particular meeting that we discussed.
That's right. I mean, they falsify documents, they suppress documents. I think here was a Japanese company that couldn't actually fathom that anybody would commit the level of fraud that they did. And they bought the company. And Malvinder and Shavinder got $2 billion from the sale.
And it's not until the Japanese have acquired the company that the company is finally prosecuted.
Right. So it's not that long after they buy the company that the FDA hits Ranbaxy with one of the biggest penalties that you can hit a company for. That's when the Daiichi Sankyo executives wake up to the fact that they have been completely defrauded and that what they have purchased is an FBI investigation and a massive liability for themselves.
But they do go after the former CEOs to get their money back.
They do. They pursue them.
Had they actually got the money back from them? Because it went through various court proceedings in Singapore and India.
Yeah, much of what happened did get reversed financially. Ultimately, after many years of litigation, and Malvinder Singh was prosecuted and spent time in jail in India.
So he did go to jail in the end?
He did, but he actually ended up going to jail for some other frauds that he had committed. He was never brought to justice in India or in the U.S. for what had happened, because ultimately, in the U.S., Ranbaxy pled guilty to numerous felony counts of falsification and fraud. But the executives of the company were never individually prosecuted.
The obvious question is, what was the Indian drug regulator doing during all this time?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. As news broke about the level of fraud that Ranbaxy had committed, the falsifications in their plants, there was never one sanction, never one inspection with findings that the Indian regulator took against Ranbaxy. And that really takes you to the heart of the problem, which is that these drug companies in India are growing up in a regulatory system where there is this sort of unbreakable nexus between the regulators and the companies.
And I think an Indian regulator will only take action if a drug is less than 70% of the active ingredients. In this case, they didn't even do that.
They did not do that. They did not do anything.
Now, we discussed how these substandard drugs are even worse when they're sold to the poorer countries, because these Indian plants have a sort of two-track system where the slightly better drugs go to Western Europe and the States. And you discuss in the book how doctors in Africa, in fact, are well aware that many of the cheap generic drugs that they have access for simply don't work. And you tell some appalling stories of patients who have likely died as a result.
I am often asked, what are some of the worst things that you uncovered? And to me, that really is the worst. I mean, it's a complete tragedy where generic drugs are supposed to really represent the democratization of pharmaceutical treatment. You make the same quality drugs, the same types of drugs available to the rich and poor alike, to all parts of the globe alike. That is the essence of the generic drug revolution. So that was the ideal. And then in practice, you have a system where numerous Indian companies are practicing dual track or row A, row B production, as it's called. And that is essentially adjusting the quality of the drug based on the intensity of the regulation you're going to face. And so for the less regulated markets, they were shipping much lower quality drugs.
And one of the revelations in your book is an FDA inspector called Peter Baker, who goes out to the FDA India office in 2012. And despite the restrictions you mentioned of having to do visits which the drug company know are happening, he's a particularly dogged investigator.
Yeah. Before Peter Baker and a few inspectors who learned from him, you would have FDA regulators going out pre-announced, going by agreement to these Indian manufacturing plants that have been all cleaned up for the arrival, then go sit in a conference room and say, bring me the data. But he didn't want the guided tour. He wanted to find out what was actually happening. So he said, I want to look in your computer systems.
He's doing a sort of forensic investigation.
Right. And once he did that, what he saw, there were all these deleted files. And those reflected secret pre-tests that the companies were doing to see if their drugs would pass inspection and how they could sort of titrate the testing to make the drugs pass, to generate fake data. But he found traces of those deleted files through metadata that was left in the computer systems. And that metadata was like this sort of sunken continent of fraud. It was a whole system that was designed to game the system.
And then he'd find cases where some of the machines that do the testing of the chemicals were offline. So actually were separate from the machines that were online recording the official data.
That's right. Many of these plants where he was inspecting, he uncovered hidden laboratories where they were doing the actual testing. And then once they had been able to sort of titrate it the way they wanted, they would move it on to the official system. And that was the data that they showed to the FDA. He inspected, I think it was close to 86 plants in India and China. And he uncovered that kind of fraud in about 4/5 of the plants he inspected.
Just going back to Ranbaxy for a moment, when the company finally collapses, which it does sometime after the Japanese have bought, of course, what happens to all of those executives who've become skilled in that data processing technique? Where do they go? They end up working in other parts of the Indian pharmaceutical industry.
Absolutely. It was a crime diaspora. They go out to other companies, they take their skill sets with them, and lo and behold, the same kinds of problems occur under their watch at other companies.
And Katherine, if this book hasn't yet been optioned, it certainly should. And at one company that Baker visits, a company called Wookart, in a scene which again sounds like a movie, he actually encounters an employee on the way to a bin with a load of garbage containing various papers.
Yeah. So just so your listeners understand, data is sacrosanct. Data is like the Rosetta Stone of quality in these manufacturing plants. You cannot alter it. You cannot destroy it. You cannot fake it. You can't delete it. And when Peter Baker showed up at one of these plants, he was in a long hallway and noticed an employee with a garbage bag walking along. And as soon as the employee realized who was behind him, namely Peter Baker, he sped up.
They're such bad fraudsters. I mean, you'd stop for a chat if you had any sense, wouldn't you? Play down the suspicion.
Yes. And Baker directs him to stop, and the guy speeds up, and Baker speeds up, and soon they're engaged in this low-speed chase down the hall of a pharmaceutical plant, and the guy tries to discard the bag, and Baker finds it and rips it open, and there is data that leads Baker to a production line within the plant that is basically committing fraud, that is creating substandard drugs for markets where they're making false claims.
It's a hidden area of the plant that he wouldn't otherwise have had access to.
Yeah. He encountered situation after situation, documents and plants being destroyed in baths of acid, newly created documents like standard operating procedures that were supposed to have been there for years, that they would age the documents by steaming them in a steam room overnight before these guys would show up, before the inspectors showed up.
It's a perfect movie.
Yeah, they would bring in data falsification teams with Post-it notes stuck all over the walls about what to falsify and change before the inspectors showed up.
Now, when you say they'll bring in data falsification teams, another indication of the systematic level, they know what they're doing.
They do what they're told to do. And what they're told to do is alter and fake data.
Now, in one plant that Baker is visiting, they're worried about the information that they're discovering and having to travel with it because, as we mentioned earlier, this is not a non-threatening environment. And so the company offers to send the inspector's material by DHL. But when the man from DHL turns up, clearly he's not really from DHL.
Yeah, there were all kinds of subterranean ruses that these companies used to thwart inspection. So one other ruse that they used was by giving them tainted tap water and sickening the inspectors. If you know that an inspector has 4 days at your plant and you can cut off 2 of those days by giving them,
Diarrhea or something.
Diarrhea through tainted tap water.
So, Katherine, how did they know that they were given tainted tap water?
Because 2 of the members of the team who drank from these bottles that had already been opened were sickened and couldn't work.
Not that they could have picked up a bug somewhere else.
No, it was directly related to the water they were given.
But although Baker is obviously incredibly successful, he actually runs training for his work and he actually wins an award for his investigative work. Ironically, it seems that the FDA actually don't want investigators who are too rigorous because that creates a problem for them. Then it reduces the drug supply, which can cause a shortage of generic drugs.
Absolutely. So, you have inspectors like Peter Baker, and every time they walk into a plant, they're going to find fraud, and they're going to find a reason to have to take that plant offline through a designation called official action indicated. Basically, you have a no action indicated, you have a voluntary action indicated, and you have official action indicated. So inspectors like Baker were sending findings of official action indicated back to headquarters. And the guys who were sitting in the headquarters were like, no, I think we're going to downgrade this finding so the plant could continue to operate.
But again, this goes back to what's the FDA's role. There's no point approving drugs that are useless and potentially dangerous.
So this is, one of the long-standing problems with the FDA, and probably other regulators as well, is you have an arm of the agency that is committed to approvals, sign-offs, building a drug supply, and then you've got another division of the agency that is committed to monitoring quality and quality post-approval, right? And those 2 arms are essentially doing opposite jobs.
And that one isn't talking to the other or not seeing it as a greater priority. The scale of this is terrifying. When you quote generic examples of the statin Lipitor, one of the biggest selling statins ever, that out of 36 generic samples, 33 had impurity levels high enough to render them ineffective.
Yeah. There is absolutely no disputing the fact that patients all over the world, including in the US, including in the UK, got substandard drugs from Ranbaxy that contained all kinds of impurities, were not properly tested. Their generic Lipitor, which had to be recalled, contained particles of glass.
And it makes me wonder how many doctors are really aware of this, because you mentioned in the Cleveland Clinic one doctor who started to see a clear pattern in his seriously ill patients when they took certain generic drugs as opposed to brand name drugs.
Right. So when I first started reporting this story in 2008, I would say the handful of doctors who understood this as an issue was minuscule. One place where I did find some acknowledgement of this issue was in medical societies for specialties that prescribed what are called narrow therapeutic index drugs. And those are drugs where the dosing is really important in psychiatry, endocrinology, neurology. You can't have a big variance in an anti-seizure medication for epilepsy or thyroid drugs. The dosing is very, very critically important. So a few of those medical societies had put out statements kind of alerting their members, doctors, to variances and to be vigilant about them. So now, fast forward, here we are, my God, like 15 years later, and many more doctors understand this as an issue.
But in the Cleveland Clinic, there were patients who potentially may have died because they were given the generic drug. By the time they got the brand name drug, it was sort of too late.
Oh, absolutely. So there were organ transplant patients who were being given immunosuppressant drugs post-transplant who wound up back in the ICU due to symptoms of organ rejection. To me, this is perfectly emblematic of the problem because here we are all enjoying cheap drugs, right? Without recognizing that there is actually a cost to these low-cost drugs, which is the cost of readmission to the hospital, becoming unstable. And so if you spend $1 million on a heart transplant for a patient, only to find that they, wind up back in the ICU once they're given a cheaper immunosuppressant drug that they need post-transplant. I mean, that's insane.
And if worst case, they pay the ultimate price and die.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, we've been largely talking about the Indian industry where they're actually making the generic drugs. Now, a lot of the raw ingredients come from China.
Right.
And that seems to create a whole extra level of problems because you've then got to trace where those raw ingredients go. And back in 2018, I think it was, the German regulators discovered that the active ingredient for Falcidin, which is the generic version of the blood pressure drug Diovan, contained a cancer-causing toxin called NDMA. And that had been used by 12 manufacturers in the US to make the generic. So even if you check where your drug was manufactured, that's not necessarily a guarantee of safety.
Absolutely not. Yeah. So the thing is, consumers are reliant on a company making the finished dose to vet the ingredients, the active ingredients that they're getting from the first person in the chain. Those folks are in China. You've got the Indian companies who are obligated to vet the quality of the ingredient, right? But if they're swapping out substandard ingredients because they're lower cost, that leaves the consumer completely exposed. And then you have the FDA that is relying on the data from the companies and not testing the drugs.
So, for example, I was looking at my box of aspirin, because aspirin is an entirely generic drug today, apart from Anodin, I suppose. But, for example, Bayer make the drug, but Bayer have manufacturing plants in the UK, but they also have them in Europe and in India or China, I can't remember. Whereas Bristol Laboratories only have a manufacturing lab for aspirin in the UK. So I'm thinking, well, in the future, I'm going to buy aspirin from Bristol Labs.
Well, that's right. I mean, another thing for consumers to consider, certainly in the US, when you go into a pharmacy like a CVS or a Duane Reade pharmacy, many of those pharmacies have their own generic brand of aspirin. But it's the Indian companies often that are the manufacturers of the store brand. And then you're reliant on whatever is the contract for inspection between the pharmacy and the manufacturer of that over-the-counter drug. And often those contracts are very flimsy.
It strikes me, the whole question of how effective we think drugs are. I remember there was a thing in Nature about 10 years ago. The drugs were not nearly as effective as we think they are. They only help between a quarter and 1 in 25 patients, something like that. But it now makes me think, well, was that actually the drug? Or were they looking at ineffective generics?
Yeah, and they may have been. But this is back to your original question of, is this getting swept under the rug? I mean, the FDA was surely turning a blind eye. But, most doctors and consumers didn't know anything about this.
Well, it's interesting. I actually had a conversation with a GP last week about it, and they assumed that generic drugs were exactly the same as brand name drugs. And that's assuming that the system is working, which clearly it's not. And I'm sure she's not alone.
It's very interesting because as one consultant to the FDA put it to me, every consumer understands that there's a difference between Cheese Whiz, supermarket cheddar, and artisanal cheddar that you buy in a specialty store. But consumers don't understand that the generic they may be taking is sort of like the Cheese Whiz version of the brand name drug, right? They don't understand the quality distinction.
So what can we do to protect ourselves? I mean, next time we're given a prescription for a drug, what should we do?
Well, for starters, I think consumers should read my book, which lays out what these distinctions are. But, what I often say to worried consumers who contact me, you need to pay attention to the manufacturer of your drug. So let's say you're on a maintenance drug and you take it every month and the drug is working. You want to know who has manufactured the drug that is working. Because what often happens with generics is because they're presumed to be interchangeable, you may be changed between generics. In other words, you got the Lupin brand one time and you got the Aurobindo brand the next. Both of those are Indian companies, by the way. And so if you have a drug that's working, you want to stay on it. But if you have a drug that's not working, you should switch.
And I think on your website, you've also got some advice.
Yes, I do.
If people are trying to make a decision about what they should do.
I have a primer in my website on how to investigate your own drugs,
which we can certainly link to on the podcast.
Please do.
But if a company has manufacturing bases both in Europe, States, and China, there's not necessarily a way of telling where your particular drug has come from.
That is really one of the problems. I have been advocating for a consumer bill of rights, for more transparency. First of all, we know with our clothes, we know with our cereal, we know with a lot of things. Made in China, made in India, you know it with your T-shirts. Why don't we know it with our drugs? Believe me, that is something that the pharmaceutical industry doesn't want, because if consumers had a choice between made in Hyderabad or made in Cork, they're going to choose Cork.
And we should say in your book, there are several Indian plants which have, well, in one case, a US main company and German main company. And in both cases, you're seeing exactly the same problems. So having the main company being in the US or Germany hasn't stopped these problems.
That's right, because many times the Western companies that have bought manufacturing plants in India have no idea what's going on inside of their own plant. Even with a company like Pfizer, which is tremendous on its security. I mean, I uncovered an instance where they had no idea what was going on inside of their own plant in China.
But I mean, some drugs now are largely generic, like, for example, penicillin. So it's not always that it's easy for somebody to go and buy the brand drug, or even possible.
That's right. Sometimes it is not possible. And then you are choosing between different generic companies. So because of all of my research, there are companies whose drugs I won't allow my family members to take.
So as a more general guide, I suppose you'd be looking for companies that are producing drugs in the US, Europe, and Japan, and I suppose Australasia.
There are companies where I believe that they are more committed to quality, and then there are companies where I know that they have been repeatedly sanctioned by the FDA for committing fraud, essentially. And I don't take those companies' drugs.
Well, Katherine, thank you so much for talking today. Absolutely terrifying. And it's just put up the amount of money I'm going to have to spend on drugs in the future. But thank you.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed the latest episode of the podcast. And if you've enjoyed the podcast, if you could share it and leave a review on Spotify and Apple, I'd much appreciate it. It really helps. Many thanks for listening. Bye for now.